A poor girl calls a mafia boss and says his daughter fainted on the street. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. I was Lena Carter, 24 years old, counting quarters in my jacket pocket while the late afternoon wind cut through the streets of downtown Chicago like it always did in March. The sky hung low and gray, and my phone said it was 38 degrees, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones no matter how tight you pulled your coat. I had just finished a short shift at a corner grocery, the kind of job that paid cash and didn't ask questions, and I was walking toward the bus stop, already planning how to stretch a dollar menu dinner into something that would last until morning. That was when I heard the sound behind me, soft at first, like someone sitting down too fast, then a small gasp that made me turn. A little girl was on the sidewalk near the curb, her backpack tipped over, one sneaker half off her foot. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, lashes resting against her cheeks, as if she'd simply fallen asleep in the wrong place. I dropped my bag without thinking and knelt beside her, my knees pressing into the cold concrete. I checked her breathing the way my high school health teacher once showed us, slow and steady. Thank God. People passed by, some slowing, some pretending not to see. I waved at a man across the street and asked him to call for help, but he shook his head and kept walking. My hands were shaking as I searched the girl's backpack for anything useful. Inside, there was a water bottle, a lunchbox, and a small leather pouch with a phone number card tucked inside. The name on it didn't mean much to me at first, just 2 words printed in clean black letters. Victor Hale. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the call button, because something about that name felt heavy, like it carried weight I didn't understand. The girl stirred slightly, her brow furrowing, and that decided it for me. I pressed call. The line picked up after 1 ring. A man's voice answered, calm and controlled, the kind of voice that didn't waste time on greetings. I swallowed and told him exactly what I saw, exactly where I was, my words tumbling over each other despite my effort to stay calm. I said his daughter had fainted on the street. There was a pause on the line, brief but absolute, like the world had stopped to listen. He asked me to stay where I was. His tone didn't rise, didn't threaten, but it carried an authority that made my spine straighten. I ended the call and looked back down at the little girl, brushing her hair away from her forehead with the edge of my sleeve. I told her my name, even though she couldn't hear me. I told her everything would be okay, even though I wasn't sure it would. Sirens hadn't arrived yet, but somewhere in the distance, I felt something shifting, like the city itself had just taken notice of a girl who was never supposed to matter. I stayed on my knees beside her, one hand hovering near her shoulder, unsure whether touching her would help or make things worse. Her breathing was steady, shallow but calm, and when I pressed 2 fingers lightly against her wrist the pulse was there, soft and fast like a bird's. Cars passed, tires hissing over damp pavement, and somewhere a bus groaned to a stop, doors folding open with a tired sigh. Time stretched in a strange way, every second louder than the last. I checked my phone. 3 minutes had passed since the call, though it felt longer. The girl stirred again, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak. Emily, I remembered, because the name had been stitched into the corner of her backpack. I said it quietly, hoping it would anchor her. Her eyelids fluttered, not fully open, just enough for me to see the blue beneath. She looked confused, then tired, then calm again, as if she trusted the sidewalk more than she should have. I told her my name, told her she was safe, even though the word safe felt fragile on my tongue. A black sedan turned the corner at the end of the block, then another behind it, both moving with purpose that did not match the rest of the street. They slowed, stopped, and suddenly the air felt different, heavier, like a storm about to break without rain. Doors opened. Men stepped out, dressed neatly, scanning the area with quiet efficiency. They did not shout. They did not run. They moved like people who expected the world to make room for them. One of them approached me and knelt at a respectful distance, asking calmly if I was the one who called. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. He thanked me, a simple statement, then spoke softly into an earpiece. Another car arrived, Longer, darker, windows tinted so deeply I could not see inside. When the door opened, the man who stepped out did not rush. He walked toward us with measured steps, his coat perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable until his eyes found the girl on the ground. Something shifted then, subtle but unmistakable, like a door opening behind his ribs. He knelt beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and said her name once, quietly. Emily's eyes opened again, wider this time. She focused on him immediately, relief washing over her small face. "Daddy," she whispered, the word thin but clear. He let out a breath he had been holding, and for a moment he was not a powerful man or anything else the city might have whispered about him. He was just a father. He looked at me then, really looked, and his gaze was sharp without being cruel, assessing without accusation. "You stayed," he said, his voice low and even. "Most people do not." I shrugged, suddenly aware of how small I must have looked kneeling there with my worn jacket and scuffed shoes. "She needed help," I replied, because there was nothing else to say. He nodded once, as if filing the answer away. He signaled to the men behind him, and they moved in smoothly, lifting Emily with care, wrapping her in a coat that looked far too expensive for a sidewalk. She reached for my hand as they did, her fingers curling around mine with surprising strength. "Do not go," she murmured, and my chest tightened. I squeezed her hand gently and told her she was going to be okay, that her dad was right there. She smiled faintly and let go. As they carried her toward the car, the man stayed with me for a moment longer. "Victor Hale," he said, not as an introduction but as a fact. "Thank you for calling me." There was no grand gesture, no dramatic promise, just a steady look and a quiet acknowledgement that felt heavier than money. Then he turned and followed his daughter, the door closing softly behind him. The cars pulled away, leaving the street exactly as it had been, gray and busy and indifferent. I stood there alone, my hands still trembling, unaware that by stopping that afternoon, by making one phone call, I had stepped into a world that would not forget me. I did not realize how much my body hurt until I started walking again, my legs stiff from kneeling on the concrete, and my fingers numb from the cold and from whatever had just passed through my life. The bus arrived late, like it always did, and I rode it home with my forehead against the window, watching the city blur by as if nothing unusual had happened. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way Victor Hale had looked at his daughter, the way his entire presence had shifted without a word. It stayed with me, heavier than the rumble of traffic outside my apartment. The next morning came too early. I dressed for another shift, pulling on the same worn jacket, tying my hair back, convincing myself that yesterday was over. It was not. By noon, my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. I let it go to voicemail, because unfamiliar numbers usually meant trouble or bills I could not pay. The message was brief and polite, asking me to return the call when convenient. No pressure, no explanation. I waited until my break, then called back with my heart beating faster than it should have. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and it asked if I was Lena Carter. When I said yes, the man told me he was calling on behalf of Mr. Hale. He said Emily was resting and doing well. The words loosened something tight in my chest. He said Mr. Hale wanted to thank me properly and asked if I would be willing to meet. I almost said no out of habit, because nothing in my life involved private meetings with powerful strangers, but the image of Emily's small hand reaching for mine stopped me. I agreed. The address they gave me was downtown, in a part of the city I usually pass through without stopping. When I arrived that evening, the building rose above the street in quiet confidence, glass and stone reflecting the fading light. Inside, everything smelled clean and expensive. A woman at the desk greeted me by name and guided me upstairs. Victor Hale was already there, standing near the window, looking out at the city as if he owned every inch of it. He turned when I entered, his expression neutral but attentive. "Thank you for coming," he said. I nodded, suddenly aware of how small my voice sounded when I replied. He did not waste time. He told me Emily had fainted from exhaustion and dehydration, nothing serious, but frightening all the same. He told me she had spoken about me twice already, about the girl who stayed. He studied me as he spoke, not unkindly, but thoroughly. He offered to compensate me for my time, for my help. I shook my head before he could finish. "I did not do it for money," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. He seemed to consider that, then nodded. Good, he replied, as if confirming something to himself. He asked about my life, my work, where I lived. I answered carefully, honestly, unsure what mattered and what did not. He listened without interrupting. When the meeting ended, he walked me to the elevator himself. As the doors closed, he said quietly that if I ever needed anything, I could call the same number again. Not as a favor, he added, but as a responsibility he chose to carry. I went home with my thoughts racing, unaware that his interest did not end at gratitude, and that from that moment on, someone was paying attention to my safety, my routines, my small, fragile place in the city. I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed, but small details began to feel different almost immediately, like the city had shifted half an inch to the left without telling me. The walk to work felt quieter, even when traffic was loud, and I noticed the same dark sedan parked across the street 2 mornings in a row. It never followed me, never moved when I passed, but it was there, present in a way that made my shoulders tighten. I told myself it was coincidence. Chicago was full of black cars. Still, when my shift ended late one evening and rain started falling hard enough to soak my shoes, the bus I usually caught pulled up almost instantly, doors opening as if it had been waiting. I sat near the back, damp hair sticking to my neck, wondering if Victor Hale's definition of responsibility included things like timing and shelter. A week passed like that. Then 2. Emily started sending small messages to my phone, simple things like drawings of flowers or a smiling sun, always with a short note saying she hoped I was having a good day. I never asked how she got my number. I did not need to. One afternoon, she asked if I would come have lunch with her. I hesitated longer than I should have, then agreed. The restaurant was quiet and bright, the kind of place with cloth napkins and soft music that made you sit up straighter. Emily ran to me the moment she saw me, wrapping her arms around my waist with unfiltered joy. Victor watched from a short distance, his expression unreadable, but his eyes softened when she laughed. Lunch was easy, surprisingly so. Emily talked about school, about a new book she loved, about how she wanted a dog someday. Victor listened, occasionally glancing at me as if gauging my reactions. When she excused herself to wash her hands, he spoke quietly. She trusts you, he said. I did not answer right away, because the weight of that sentence felt heavier than any favor. He told me he wanted Emily to spend time with someone who reminded her of the world outside schedules and security. Someone normal. The words sounded strange coming from him. I told him I was not special. He almost smiled. The days after that settled into a rhythm I had not expected. I saw Emily once or twice a week, sometimes at a park, sometimes at a quiet cafe. Victor was always nearby, never hovering, never far. I learned the way he watched rooms, how he placed himself between Emily and exits without thinking. He learned that I drank my coffee with too much sugar and that I hated being late more than I hated being poor. One night, walking home after dinner, I realized someone was arguing loudly near my building. I slowed, uncertain, then noticed the familiar sedan at the curb, its engine running. A man stepped out, nodding once at me before the argument abruptly ended and the voices disappeared down the block. He opened my building door as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Inside my apartment, I stood in the dim light, heart racing, finally understanding that Victor's protection was not a suggestion. It was already in motion. The next morning, my landlord knocked on my door, unusually polite, telling me my rent situation had been adjusted and not to worry anymore. I felt anger rise, sharp and unexpected, because I had not asked for that kind of help. When I called Victor, my voice shook as I told him so. He listened without interrupting, then said he understood and that no more decisions would be made without my consent. I did not know whether to believe him, but I believed that he meant it. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, aware that I was standing at the edge of something I could not yet name, something that felt both safe and dangerously permanent. I thought setting boundaries would make things simpler, but instead it changed the temperature of everything around us. Victor kept his word in visible ways. No more sudden fixes, no unexplained conveniences. My rent stayed paid because I worked extra hours, not because someone else decided it for me. Still, his presence remained, quieter now, like a shadow that respected distance but never left. Emily noticed the shift before either of us talked about it. She asked why I seemed tired even when I smiled. why her father looked out the window longer than usual when we were together. I did not have answers that would make sense to an 8-year-old. One afternoon, I found her sitting alone in a small library room, her feet swinging above the floor as she read. She looked up and asked if I would ever stop coming. The question landed harder than it should have. I told her I was not planning on disappearing. She nodded, satisfied, then went back to her book as if that promise were enough. Later that evening, Victor asked if we could talk privately. We sat across from each other in a quiet lounge, the city glowing beyond the glass. He told me he understood my fear of being controlled, that his world was built on decisions made quickly and without permission, and that he did not want to pull me into that by force or habit. He said protecting people was easy. Respecting them was harder. I listened, arms crossed, unsure whether words could balance actions already taken. I told him I needed to choose my own life, even if it was smaller and messier than his. He nodded, accepting that without argument, and for the first time I saw something like uncertainty in his eyes. Days later, I noticed a woman outside my workplace asking questions about me, friendly but too curious, her smile lingering a moment too long. That night, I mentioned it to Victor without thinking and immediately regretted it. He asked details, calm but focused. I reminded him of my boundary. He paused, then said he would only make sure the curiosity stayed harmless. I did not know what that meant, but I did not press. The following week, the woman never returned. No explanations, no drama, just absence. I felt relief mixed with unease, a reminder that Victor's idea of harmless still operated on a scale I could not fully see. Emily's birthday arrived in early spring, celebrated with more balloons than I had ever seen in one place. She asked me to stay for the whole party, not just the cake. Victor watched us from across the room, his expression softer than usual, and when Emily fell asleep on the couch with her head on my shoulder, he covered her gently with a blanket. "Thank you," he said quietly, not for that moment, but for everything that had led to it. I told him I was still figuring out what my place was in their lives. He replied that places did not have to be permanent to matter. Walking home later, the night felt calmer than it had in weeks. I realized then that the danger I feared was not only from his world, but from the pull of it, from how easy it was to feel safe when someone powerful decided you were worth protecting. I understood that if I stayed, it had to be because I chose to, not because I was sheltered from consequences. As I unlocked my apartment door, my phone buzzed with a message from Victor, simple and direct, saying he would give me space if that was what I needed, but that his door would remain open. I stood there for a long moment, phone in hand, knowing that the next step was mine alone, and that whatever I decided would change the shape of my future in ways I could not yet predict. I tried to take the space Victor offered, but space turned out to be quieter than I expected, and quiet had a way of amplifying thoughts I had been avoiding. I focused on work, on routines that made sense because they were small and measurable, hours clocked, tips counted, groceries carried up 3 flights of stairs. Emily's messages slowed to one every few days, never demanding, always warm. Victor did not call. The city returned to its usual indifference, and I told myself that was a good thing. Then one evening, as I left my shift and stepped into the glow of the streetlights, I noticed a man standing near the corner, pretending to check his phone while watching the door. He smiled when our eyes met, too quickly, and asked if I knew where to find a late-night diner. The question was harmless, but something about the way he asked it made my stomach tighten. I gave a vague answer and kept walking, my pace steady until I turned the corner and my hands started to shake. The next morning, there was a note taped to my apartment door, no name, just a message saying I had dropped something outside my workplace. I had not. I did not call Victor right away. I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle my own life. 2 days later, the same man appeared again, this time across the street from my building, still smiling, still waiting. Fear crept in quietly, not dramatic, just persistent. That night, I called Victor. He answered on the first ring. I did not tell him everything, just enough. He listened, then asked one question, whether I wanted him to step in. The choice mattered. I said yes. The relief that followed was immediate and unsettling. The next day, the man was gone. No explanation, no confrontation, just absence, like a page torn cleanly from a book. Victor called later to check on me, his voice careful, restrained. He did not ask for thanks. He did not remind me of favors. He asked if I felt safe. I said I did, and meant it. A week later, he invited me to a small gathering at his home, not a party, just dinner. Emily had insisted, he said. I agreed, partly for her, partly because I was tired of pretending distance was neutrality. The house was quieter than I imagined, warm and lived in, not the cold fortress I had pictured. Emily showed me her room, her drawings taped neatly to the wall, each one a small declaration of happiness. At dinner, Victor asked about my day, about my plans, listening as if the answers mattered. After Emily went to bed, we sat in the living room with the lights low. He told me he did not want to be the kind of man whose presence erased other people's choices. He admitted that it was easier for him to control outcomes than to trust them. I told him I was still afraid, not of him exactly, but of how easily my life bent around his gravity. He accepted that without defense. He said trust was not a contract. It was something built slowly, or not at all. When I left that night, the air felt lighter. Walking home, I realized that the line between protection and control depended on consent, on conversation, on the courage to say no and the willingness to hear it. I understood that choosing to stay connected did not mean surrendering myself, and that asking for help did not make me small. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I knew the danger was not gone, but I also knew I was not facing it alone, not because someone decided that for me, but because I had chosen to let them stand beside me. I thought I understood what choosing this connection meant until the night everything tightened at once, not loud or explosive, but sharp enough to cut. Emily had a school recital, a small one, held in a modest auditorium with folding chairs and uneven lighting. I sat in the second row, hands folded in my lap, watching her scan the audience until she found me, and smiled with relief. Victor stood near the back, unobtrusive, letting her world be small and normal for that hour. She sang softly, a little off-key, and I felt something warm spread through my chest, the quiet pride of being allowed into a moment that did not belong to me by blood. Afterward, Emily hugged me so hard I laughed, then ran to her father to show him the ribbon she had earned. We said our goodbyes in the parking lot, the air cool and calm, and I drove home feeling lighter than I had in weeks. That feeling did not last. The next morning, my phone rang before sunrise. It was Victor. His voice was steady, but there was an edge beneath it I had never heard before. He asked where I was. I told him I was home. He told me to stay there, and said he was coming. I asked why. He did not answer, only repeated my name once, firmly, like an anchor. When he arrived, he did not come alone. The men who stayed near the door were quiet, respectful, their presence a reminder that something had gone wrong. Victor sat across from me, his attention complete. He told me someone had tried to use my name to reach him, to test whether I mattered. It was not an attack, he said, but it was a message. My stomach dropped. I asked if Emily was safe. He said yes immediately, without hesitation, and I believed him. He explained that his world responded to perceived leverage, and that my safety had become part of his responsibility, whether I wanted it or not. I told him that scared me. He nodded, accepting that truth. He did not minimize it. He asked if I trusted him to handle it. The question was different from before. It was not about stepping in quietly. It was about standing in front. I took a breath and said yes, because the alternative was pretending I was invisible when I was not. The next few days passed in a strange calm. I stayed home, worked remotely when I could, watched the street from my window. Victor checked in regularly, never hovering, never distant. Emily sent me a voice message telling me about a math test she thought she had failed, then another laughing because she had actually done well. Normal life continued, alongside the tension, and that contrast made everything feel sharper. One evening, Victor came alone. He told me the message had been answered, that the line had been drawn clearly. He did not give details, and I did not ask. I only asked if it was over. He said yes, for now, and then added that it would not touch me again. There was something final in the way he said it, not violent, just absolute. I realized then that this was the shape of his protection, not reactive, but preventative, built on certainty. I told him I did not want to live in fear of shadows. He replied that fear thrived on uncertainty, and that clarity was his way of keeping it at bay. We stood there in my small living room, the difference between our worlds compressed into a few feet of worn carpet. I understood that his promise came with weight, with consequences I would never fully see, and that accepting it meant accepting him as he was, not as I wished him to be. As he left, He paused at the door and said something that stayed with me long after it closed. He said that choosing to protect someone was easy, but choosing to let them see the cost was harder, and that he was trusting me with both. When I locked the door behind him, my hands were steady. I knew the danger had been faced, not erased, and that the next step would not be about safety alone, but about whether I could stand beside a man whose silence carried more power than most people's words. I did not see Victor for several days after that, not because he disappeared, but because he gave me what he had promised, clarity instead of presence. Life settled into a careful rhythm. Work, home, messages from Emily that arrived like small anchors throughout the day. She asked when I would come over again, and I told her soon, because soon felt honest without being specific. The quiet gave me space to think about what it meant to stand beside someone whose decisions shaped more than his own life. I realized that fear had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer about being watched or followed. It was about responsibility, about what it meant to matter in a world that measured value in leverage. When Victor finally invited me to dinner again, I accepted without hesitation. The house felt familiar now, less intimidating, like a place that had learned how to breathe. Emily greeted me at the door, pulling me inside to show me a school project she was proud of. Victor watched us from the hallway, his posture relaxed in a way I rarely saw. Dinner was quiet and warm. No tension, no unspoken warnings. After Emily went to bed, Victor and I sat at the kitchen table, the room lit softly, the city distant beyond the windows. He told me something he had never said out loud before, that his life had been built on anticipating threats, on removing risks before they could become losses. He said Emily had changed that, made him care about outcomes beyond survival. Then he looked at me and said I had changed it again, not by demanding anything, but by reminding him that protection without choice was just another form of fear. I told him I was still learning how to exist in his orbit without losing myself. He replied that he was learning how to let someone close without turning them into something he owned. The words mattered because they were not promises. They were acknowledgments. He asked me what I wanted. The question surprised me with its simplicity. I said I wanted honesty, even when it was uncomfortable, and space to walk away if I ever needed to. He nodded, accepting that condition without negotiation. He said he did not want to cage anything that chose to stay. In the weeks that followed, that understanding settled between us like solid ground. Emily started spending more time with me, sometimes at my apartment, sometimes at the park, laughing in a way that made strangers smile. Victor stayed in the background, always present, never imposing. One evening, as I walked home alone under a clear sky, I realized I was no longer scanning shadows. Not because danger had disappeared, but because I trusted the choices I had made. I had not been pulled into his world by force or fear. I had stepped into it with open eyes. When Victor called later that night, his voice was calm, familiar. He asked how my day had been. I told him about a small victory at work, about Emily's drawing taped crookedly to my fridge. He listened, and when he spoke, it was with a quiet certainty that no longer frightened me. He said that some people came into your life like storms, loud and destructive, but others came like anchors, steady and grounding, if you let them. I understood then that redemption was not about erasing the past. It was about choosing differently in the present. As I set my phone down and looked around my small apartment, I felt something I had not expected when all of this began. Not fear, not awe, but belonging, not to his power, but to a future shaped by choice, where protection and humanity could exist side by side. I did not realize how quietly the end would arrive until I was standing in the same part of the city where everything had begun, the sidewalk washed clean by recent rain, the air warmer now, late spring settling in. Emily walked between Victor and me, her small hand in mine, her other firmly in his, swinging happily as she talked about summer plans and ice cream flavors. It felt ordinary in a way that once would have seemed impossible. We had come back for no dramatic reason, no ceremony. Just a walk after dinner, a chance for Emily to show me the spot where she said she remembered waking up and seeing my face. She pointed to the curb and smiled, as if it were a place of magic. Victor stood there quietly, listening, his gaze distant for a moment, then grounded again. He said thank you, not formally, not carefully, just plainly, like a man who understood the weight of timing. We walked on, and I realized that nothing more needed to be said about that day. It had already done its work. Later, after Emily fell asleep in the back seat on the drive home, Victor and I sat in silence for a few miles, the city lights slipping past like a slow tide. He told me he had made changes, not announcements or declarations, just choices, quieter paths that led away from some doors and closer to others. He did not frame them as sacrifices. He framed them as corrections. I told him that I had changed too, that I no longer measured safety by distance from danger, but by the honesty of the people I allowed close. He nodded, understanding that was not a compliment, but a shared truth. When we reached my apartment, he walked me to the door as he always did now, not as a guard, but as someone who respected the threshold. Before I went inside, he said something that felt like a conclusion without trying to be one. He said that power was loud when it was insecure, but quiet when it knew where it belonged. I thought about that long after I closed the door. Weeks passed, then months, and life continued without sharp edges. Emily grew taller, more confident. Victor learned how to wait. I learned how to stay without shrinking. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic promises about forever. Just consistency. Just choices made again and again. One afternoon, as I watched Emily draw at my kitchen table, crayons spread everywhere, she looked up and asked if I was part of her family. The question caught me off guard in its simplicity. I looked at Victor, who was leaning against the counter, watching us with an expression that held both restraint and hope. I told her that families were not only about names or blood, but about who showed up when it mattered. She considered that, then smiled and went back to coloring, apparently satisfied. Victor met my eyes, and in that moment I understood the full shape of what had happened. He had not rescued me. I had not saved him. We had met at a point of vulnerability and chosen not to look away. As evening settled in and the city hummed outside my window, I felt no need to define what we were or where we were going. The story did not need a title anymore. It had become something lived instead of told. I understood that redemption was not a single act or a dramatic turning point. It was a series of small, deliberate decisions made in the open. And as I watched Emily hum softly to herself, safe and unaware of how close the world had once come to missing her light, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is answer a call, stay when others walk away, and allow two lives from different worlds to change each other quietly, forever.